Hello everyone, it is the Monday of Holy Week and we are ready for our second lesson in our series of study on Mark chapters 11 through 15 called Who is this man called Jesus? And yesterday on Palm Sunday we entered Jerusalem with Jesus, and we saw the first aspect of Christ, that Jesus is King. And so today we're going to look at what happened as Jesus continued in that week leading up to the crucifixion on the Monday of that week, and we'll learn another aspect of who he is and who he wants to be in our life and in our relationship with him. So let's go right into it, Mark chapter 11, and we'll continue where we left off yesterday, beginning in verse 12. And we're going to read verses 12 through 19. Again, I am reading through the New Revised Standard Version. And in Mark chapter 11, verse 12, it says, "On the following day, which would be the Monday of that week, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the table of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, 'Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. For they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city." So here in this passage, we see two events that happened on the Monday of that week. First was this incident with the fig tree, which I'm actually going to hold off, and we're going to talk about that in conjunction with tomorrow's lesson, as we see what happened to that fig tree that Jesus cursed. But today we want to focus on the second part of that story, which is one that we've often heard about, Jesus driving out the sellers and the buyers and the money changers from the temple. He cleanses the temple is what this is called. And that is important, the idea of cleansing. What he's doing is he's driving out people who have set up shop in the temple. They are there, people buying animals, doves, lambs, other animals for sacrifice. There are people selling those animals. The whole temple complex has become a livestock auction. He's dealing with an issue that became important as Judaism had spread throughout the known world of that day, which was that there was one location for worship. That was Jerusalem. The temple was the only location where the sacrifices ordained by the Old Testament could be made. So Jews from all over the known world, from the Mediterranean era, from what is now Iran, or from Egypt, all had to come to Jerusalem on these festivals. And as we're looking at this time period, we're closing in on the Jewish festival of Passover, there were certain sacrifices that had to be made. Well, if you were traveling a long distance, you wouldn't be bringing the animals for the sacrifice with you. You would have to buy them there. And so there had grown up around the temple and actually moved into the temple the buying and selling of these animals for sacrifice. It was a necessity. It was something that was required for the worship that was taking place in the Old Testament format, but it should not have been the focus. The issue was not that people were buying and selling these sacrificial animals. It was the fact they were doing it within the temple itself. When we look back in Exodus or First Chronicles at the description of the tabernacle or of the building of the first temple with Solomon, we don't find anywhere described that there should be set up or built a place for the buying and selling of this livestock for these sacrifices. That should have been done outside the temple. It should have been something that was taken care of before you arrived at the temple location, because the temple's purpose was for worship. The whole point of arriving at the temple was to connect with God, to fulfill your requirements under the Old Testament law to make these sacrifices, but in doing so, to show your faith and to show your connection to God himself. However, the temple's purpose as a location of worship had been lost in the hubbub and the toing and froing of all these people coming to buy and sell these animals. The most noticeable aspect of the temple location was not the worship that took place there, but the business that took place there. So extraneous factors had eclipsed the temple's purpose of being a place of worship. It was no longer holy. What we look at in that sense of the word holy means set apart for God's purpose. The temple location was to be exactly that, set apart for the worship of God, for His purpose, not for business transactions. So what we see in the passage we read is that Jesus, who is the Holy One, and in that sense we mean holy as in one who is perfect in goodness and righteousness. The Holy One, Jesus, comes in to cleanse the temple and restore it to be holy again, set apart for God's purpose. This is what we see, the aspect of Jesus that we learn in today's passage is that Jesus is holy. We saw yesterday that He was king, but today we see that He is a holy king, one who is perfect in goodness, perfect in righteousness, and demands that holiness, that set apart nature in all that is dedicated to Him and to worship. Now, if we look carefully at this passage, again, the second half of the passage, beginning maybe in verse 15, when it says they came to Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. So He drove out the pollution. He kept out all of those things that were causing the temple to be taken away from its actual purpose. But that was not enough. Look at verse 16. And He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. If someone came trying to use the Temple Mount as a shortcut from one place of the city to another, Jesus stopped them and would not allow them through. Because this is another aspect that had diminished the temple's holiness, was that it was not seen as a place of worship, but simply as a shortcut from one part of the city to another. With the Temple Mount sitting square in the middle of the eastern half of the city, people did not want to detour all the way around this temple complex to get from one place to another, so they simply passed through it. But entering the temple, the whole courtyard, the whole area of the temple required, according to Leviticus, a level of purity, a level of holiness of the person, as well as a right attitude within the heart, an attitude of worship, an attitude of praise to enter into the temple area. So Jesus not only drove out those that were polluting the temple with their presence through making it a place of business, but He also refused to allow people to come in who were not respecting the temple for its ordained purpose of holiness. When these people were just using it as a shortcut, they were not treating the temple with respect. This means they were not setting it apart in their hearts. And when you set something apart for the purpose of God, that is the very definition of that thing being holy. Holy meaning set apart. Now, when we talk about holiness here, it's not about a location, it's not about the building of the temple itself, it's about our hearts. And we need to today consider, are we treating our heart, the seat of our worship, with the same lack of respect that these people were treating the Temple Mount in Jesus' day? Have we allowed pollution to come into our heart and make us unholy in the presence of God? Are we focused more on business, on our work? Are we focused on our family? Are we focused on our own pleasures or recreation? Have we allowed these things to pollute our temple and cause our hearts to not be focused on worshiping God and to be devoted to Him as we're called to be? Or are we treating our relationship with God as something to be considered lightly, like the people who use the Temple Mount as a shortcut? Are we not setting apart our relationship with God as something to be cherished and something to be prized? If either of these things are happening, then our worship is no longer holy, and our hearts are not where they should be in worshiping Jesus, who is the Holy One. Now, we are called to this holiness. It's not something we should neglect. When we look in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, Peter tells us there that instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all of your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. We said that what we learned today in our lesson is that Jesus is holy. And here in Peter, in verse 16 of chapter 1, it says, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Just as Jesus is holy, perfect in goodness and righteousness, then we are to be holy in setting ourselves apart and devoting our lives to his obedience. Just as we said yesterday, we should bring ourselves into willing obedience to the King, then today we see that that is part of holiness, that we set ourselves apart to submit our lives to him. This is very important that we do this, that we cleanse our lives. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, it says, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. We're told here by Paul, in addition to Peter, who we just read, that we should set ourselves apart, we should cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, and perfect holiness in the fear of God. Because we respect him, because we have submitted ourselves to the King, then we should perfect holiness, that we should set ourselves apart for that purpose. And if we don't think that this holiness is really that necessary, we need to be even more careful, because in Hebrews chapter 12, we have a very sobering statement in Hebrews 12 and 14, where we're told, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Without holiness, no man shall see the Lord. If we want to be in right relationship with Jesus, the Holy One, then we must set ourselves apart. Likewise, we must also be holy. We cannot treat our relationship with Jesus lightly, like the people in Jesus' day were treating the temple. They treated the temple as just another place to do business, another place to move through the city. They did not treat it as a special place set apart for the worship of God. Our lives we are called to be set apart for the worship of God. And are we taking that lightly, or are we taking it seriously? So I encourage you today to examine yourselves, as I'm examining myself, to see if there's some area in our life where we are not setting ourselves fully apart to worship God as we should. Is there some area we're holding back, or some area that we want to keep for ourselves, or that we're allowing pollution to come in, outside influences that are drawing us away from God? Or are we just simply not taking it as seriously as we should? So let that be our encouragement for today, that we see this second aspect of Jesus, that he is holy, and that we be holy as he is. Tomorrow we'll continue on with the third lesson, and this is a little bit larger section of reading, so I do ask that you would read ahead tonight and be ready to go tomorrow. Mark chapter 11 verse 20 all the way through the end of Mark chapter 13. That's a little more than 2 chapters worth, but it is the day that we have the most information about in this last week of Jesus. So I do ask you to read Mark chapter 11 verse 20 through the end of Mark chapter 13 for tomorrow, and I'll see you at that lesson.